So just a reminder that a lot of what is spoken about, in fact everything that is spoken about, is spoken about in the context of the topic of these talks. And the topic of these talks is happiness in daily living. So if someone were to listen to a segment in the middle, they might find all sorts of problems with the concepts that are put forward, going, oh, that's not right, and that's not right, because relative to a different topic, they may actually not hold water, just like other concepts that are appropriate in relation to a specific topic. If heard in relation to another topic, another outcome, another point, the statements might not be accurate. But in relation to this particular topic of happiness for the human being in daily living, the concepts that are put forward are, in my view, accurate and only relevant to, as in, all I'm really talking about is happiness in daily living. So if someone is interested in the topic of happiness in daily living, then this is the place to be, because that's all we're talking about. Now, happiness can sound mundane to some people, especially if they have an idea of what happiness is, and the idea of happiness will come from our definition of the word happiness. And it's fair to say that in general terms, happiness means a feeling good, an excitement, a feeling of, oh, life is wonderful because this is happening, because I'm on holiday, because my best friend is arriving, because I've just become a grandmother. Well, not me. And because that essentially is pleasure, if there's going to be a lot of people, not a lot, but groups of people that have realized that pleasure and happiness in that form is really not that much of a noble pursuit. So if you talk about, oh, these talks are all about happiness, someone might say, well, I'll leave that up to someone else. I think there's greater meaning in life than happiness. And if someone said that, I think that they are talking about a happiness of pleasure, which is bound to be limited and fleeting, because the flow of life is always changing, and what happens in life is not going to be agreeable to us a lot of the time, because our preferences are, wanting life to deliver positive outcomes that are pleasurable, and that's not always going to be the case. So happiness in the form of pleasure is sort of grasping for something that we are only going to be able to hold on to for limited periods of time, which is great to enjoy it while we can hold on to it, but to invest the notion that that is all important, after doing that for a while, we'll conclude, actually, I'm not going to pursue happiness. Now, this teachings is actually what we're really looking for deep down, beyond our ideas of what we're looking for, which are often misguided. The teachings is what we're really looking for, whether we realize it or not, is happiness in daily living. So it's basically said it's the jewel in the crown. Happiness is the jewel in the crown. But it then goes on to say, in the same breath, essentially, that happiness that is spoken about as the jewel in the crown is, excuse me? Oh, hang on. This is a sneeze on its way. It doesn't seem to want to quite make it out. So the teaching here says actually happiness, whether we realize it or not, is the jewel in the crown. It's what we are really looking for, which really means it's what we should be looking for. It's what it's the only thing in life that will satisfy. But in the same breath, it goes out to say that happiness that is spoken about as the jewel in the crown is not at all a happiness through pleasure, pleasure, pleasure. It isn't the happiness that we might call happiness when we get something we want and feel good about it. It's really saying that the happiness that is being spoken about as the jewel in the crown is actually a happiness in the form of unbroken peace of mind. Continuous unbroken peace of mind regardless of the circumstance you find yourself in. So that doesn't mean continuously and in an unbroken way feeling good and pleasurable about things. It doesn't mean that if your hot water stops working and it's the middle of winter and you have to have a shower and it's freezing cold, that is suddenly going to feel good. It doesn't mean that if the milk has gone bad and you drink it, that you're going to feel like this tastes wonderful, this is nice, I'm so happy I drank a glass of this milk. It doesn't mean that sort of happiness where things work out. It means a peace of mind, which is your attitude to the fact that the milk doesn't taste good. Understanding such that one doesn't go into resistance with life being that way in that moment, because it's understood that the flow of life is this mix of sometimes pleasure and sometimes pain. It's a tapestry, it's a painting, it's a experience that is an ongoing experience that is always going to change, and sometimes it's going to be pleasurable and sometimes it's going to be painful. And peace of mind is having an attitude to that allows it to be as it is, which it always is going to be, even when our attitude is different to what I'm describing. It attitudinally is not in resistance to that being the case. The alternative attitude, which we can call the attitude of personal doership and attachment to outcome, is an attitude that is in continual resistance with life as it naturally is, which is sometimes pleasure and sometimes pain. And that attitude of personal doership and attachment to outcome, which is an attitude of essentially resistance in various forms, creates an uncomfortableness that pervades the experience of life. And what that means is that the experience of life, that is sometimes pleasure and sometimes pain, is going to be accompanied by a sense, a feeling of uncomfortableness towards ultimately oneself. There is an uncomfortableness with oneself. And that uncomfortableness with oneself can be in the form of an uncomfortableness with the other. But even when we're uncomfortable with the other, we're really, when we feel into it, uncomfortable with oneself. And when we're uncomfortable with life, because life hasn't turned out a certain way, when we really feel into it, we find it's an uncomfortableness with oneself. And if this attitude changes, what we find is the uncomfortableness with life, which is a layer, an attitudinal layer that feels, well, the word I'm using is uncomfortable. I've been using it for 20 years, and Ramesh used the word uncomfortable. And when I really felt and landed on what suffering in the different forms is, I go, wow, this is an uncomfortableness that pervades the momentary experience of life. So that attitude can change. But it changes when we come to see life, know life, understand life very differently from how we have essentially become used to life. Now we've all heard of the frog in the hot water analogy, where the frog is in the water, and as it gradually gets hotter and hotter, eventually the frog dies because it boils, because the change is so slow, and the frog essentially acclimatizes to the increasing temperature and doesn't feel like it's different, or that it should leave the situation. And because we've been in life from a very young age, and it's more or less been a certain way, it's appeared a certain way, and the way that the human perception perceives life, then what's being ingrained essentially is a view of what life is, and that view gets ingrained moment after moment after moment after moment, in year 1, in year 2, in year 3, in year 10, in year 20, and so on. And it's continually being solidified and confirmed based on how we are perceiving life. And we tend not to perceive life radically differently unless it's our destiny for that to happen. And that tends to happen through being exposed to a teaching or someone that is talking about life very differently. So, for people who grew up reading science fiction, who were compelled to read science fiction, the way that they see life may be different, because the stories, the science fiction stories, may have described life, even though it was a imaginary life or a made-up version of life. There could have been some ideas in science fiction stories that made someone think about, could this be possible? And if that idea appeared in many stories that this person was reading, and if in the stories, in the science fiction, there were discussions about how this actually could be what life is, or what life could be in the future, then that person might start looking at life, thinking about life according to a different model. And most of us don't find ourselves immersed in an explanation of life that is significantly different from the view that tends to get put in place as a natural part of our development when we're not exposed to radically different types of thinking. And spiritual teachings, depending on which spiritual teachings they are, can be describing life radically differently. Now, the question is whether those descriptions really penetrate into our being in such a way that it gets us to really see on a fabric level. So because we have been perceiving life a certain way, which is basically the way that the brain produces the image of life and puts into that environment a sense of self, who we are. And because life has been building our sense of self and our feeling of who we are and where we stand in relation to life and the others, and it's been building it layer upon layer upon layer for days, weeks, months, years, etc. The description of life differently needs to somehow really penetrate. Otherwise, what can happen is it can become a sort of lip service where we think we know life radically differently. So it can be, let's say, life is all described as a happening according to God's will, for example. And we've heard it so many times that we think we believe that we think we see life as a happening according to God's will. Whereas in fact, that's landed on a superficial level, it could be. Whereas really, when we look at life, we just see it the same way that it had been put in place. And so our seeing of life hasn't been radically changed around on a fabric level. And so the notions, spiritual seeking notions, can sometimes be absorbed in a way that they are integrated into our existing version of life. Now, if that happens, you end up maybe thinking that it's understood, but actually those concepts have just been placed in a way that our existing version of life accommodates. And because there's a place found for them in our existing view of life, then they appear like they're understood, but they're not really, because they haven't really changed how we see life down at a fabric level. Now, if a change happens where we really start to see life differently on the level of the fabric, our sense of self, our attitude towards the flow of life changes radically. And that's when our attitude changes from the attitude of doership and attachment to outcome, which has this uncomfortable feeling, or it means that there is this uncomfortable thread built into the tapestry of the experience of life. And if the attitude changes, then that thread of uncomfortableness gets pulled out of the tapestry of the experience of life. And what we're left with is the flow of life, but without the me self-identity that was essentially forced to always feel uncomfortable in one way or another with life. And that's what the me identity, that is what is generally put in place by life in the way that we develop. That me identity is at its core uncomfortable. And the person that is left after the me identity dissolves, we find is at its core comfortable. So you have the way we develop in life is as a person, we're a human being, and that human being has in it, because it grows, this me identity, and the me identity is inherently uncomfortable. And when that identity that is inherently uncomfortable with life in one form or another, guilt, blame, pride, worry, or expectation, which is the me identity's attitude to the past, the future, the present, and pleasures and pains in the past, present, and future. When that's there is this uncomfortable. And then spiritual teachings can come along, and if they radically change the perception of life such that it is seen differently all the way down to the fabric, then what that tends to do is eliminate the existence of this me identity, which is really, it eradicates it because it's part of the standard way of seeing life. Okay, so in summary, we're talking about happiness in daily living. Happiness in daily living is not a happiness from winning awards, from getting told you're the best, from doing exciting things in life. That's pleasure. So we're talking about happiness. It's not happiness through pleasure, but rather happiness through our attitude to life. And the attitude is either the attitude of doership and attachment to outcome, which is based on the way we see life that has been put in place by our natural development. And that includes the me identity that is always in resistance with the fact that life is received by it as a threat to it, because it believes it needs life to be pleasure, 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 and life simply isn't that. So when it wakes up in the morning, it feels like it's in this hostile environment and has to feel uncomfortable with its very existence. Life can bring about a change by describing what life is differently that might get us to see it as it's described. I see it where there's a big click or insight, like, oh, of course, I get it. It's not as I thought it was, and now I see. And that insight it's essentially an intellectual understanding. So it can start off with a description, a concept delivered. We think about it, and in a particular moment it might click, and it might be a gradual thinking about it, and it might then click like, oh, I get it. So that's what these talks are about, hopefully. They're describing life differently in relation to happiness for the human being in this life, which is available. Many people throughout history, a very small percentage of the total population, but many people have found this change has happened. And they're familiar, because it's happened to them. They're familiar with what has happened. They're familiar with the nature of the change. They're familiar with what brought it about. They're familiar with what thinking patterns changed and when they changed and what was seen differently to lead to a change in attitude, for example, and how that change, and they're familiar with how that change in attitude led to a different relationship to life, and how that relationship to life meant a different overall experience of life. And so they can talk about it. So let's talk about, which is a continuation from yesterday's satsang, how can we see life differently? It's not so much about how we can see it. I'll describe life differently. And the description, because I'm talking about the life that is right here, the experience of life that is here for you, the description may prompt us to just think about it and understand where maybe we've been relating to things incorrectly. So I'd like to talk about two different models that are spoken about, and both of which essentially mean that the experience of life is not at all what it appears to be. One is, I guess, what we would call mystical, and might take some faith for someone to resonate with that. It might actually, someone might resonate with it because they believe the description, and because they believe it, which in itself is a problem, but that's a problem that will get dealt with later. It feels like, oh, that's the truth. There are going to be other people that go, that sounds an awful lot like religion, and I can't see any basis on which to believe that. So that is the non-dual description of life that says all of this is an appearance, and what it means by appearance is it's not fundamentally real, and that objects are not really objects, but they are just images arising in God's mind. All there is God. This is the typical non-dual teachings, which are the teachings that I came through and had a big impact on me. Say, life is awareness. Source is awareness. That all of life arises inside awareness as an appearance, like an imagination, like a dream. And that source, or awareness, or what we could call mind, imagines, it has this power, awareness, source, mind, has an inherent power inside of it. It's part of its function to create. And how it creates, because it is formless awareness, it is nothing really, it is this pure potential. Its potentiality is to manifest things within awareness. And you can, depending on if you use, if your definition of consciousness is loose enough, you could say awareness or consciousness, consciousness or source, consciousness or mind. So I might use the word consciousness every now and again, but it might be easier to keep in mind awareness. Now, we often think of awareness as something that something has. Like the animal has awareness, Roger has awareness, the body, the person has awareness. In the description of non-duality, or Advaita in particular, awareness is referring to God, and awareness, and God doesn't have awareness, God is awareness. And all there is God, which really means all there is awareness. And awareness is at rest or in movement. At rest means in its potential state, and in movement means in its creating active state. When it's in its rest state, you could, if you like, you could think of that as, if you use the metaphor of a person sleeping at night, we could say that, well, let's leave the person out of it because it might confuse things. What we're saying is all there is God. And God doesn't have awareness, God is awareness. Awareness is formless. Awareness doesn't arise inside of time or space. If anything, time and space arises, becomes real, emerges within awareness. So awareness is fundamental. Awareness is primary. Awareness is source. Awareness is the only thing that is real. Everything else is after awareness and essentially made of awareness, arising in awareness. So all there is Brahman, God. And God is awareness. Now, if we talk about awareness and use the word mind, we can say that all there is mind. Now, I'm not talking about the human mind. I'm just saying, calling it mind. It's a label, essentially. And the nature of mind is awareness. So mind doesn't have awareness. Mind is awareness. Just like God doesn't have awareness, God is awareness. So really all there is God, or all there is mind, or all there is awareness. And you can see that these are all names for essentially the same thing. I'm saying they are different ways of describing what is. And hopefully to create a sense, an image, you could say, in your thinking, so that we can do some thought experiments. And what we might find is that those thought experiments reveal what is here now. Because all of these descriptions in non-duality and the more down-to-earth, I guess, version, which we could call the science explanation, are there because what they're pointing at can be revealed and can be experienced right here by us. So they're not meant to be theories that remain essentially on pages in a book or in some part of our thinking where we develop the idea more and more as a thought and remain disconnected, have that thought disconnected from the present moment. Really what we're trying to do is paint a picture of what God is in a way, and hopefully I'm painting a picture with very little objects in it at this point, saying all there is God, and God is essentially awareness, and awareness is not something that something has, but awareness is formless, and it starts off in its, you'd say, its most basic form is awareness at rest, when it isn't actively creating. Now, the best example we have, the first-hand frame of reference for awareness, is the awareness we know as the human's awareness. Now, remember that I also use the word mind interchangeably with awareness. So we can come to the human mind and examine that to give us an idea of what I mean by all there is God, and God is awareness, and God is mind. So we come to the human mind. Now, we might mistake mind and brain as the same thing. The way that I'm using it is, let's assume there is a real human being, which might be the case, but not in this example. It's not. We're coming to the human being simply as a means of trying to understand what mind is, because the human mind, if we get to investigate that, is essentially a mirror down version of this universal mind that I'm speaking of. So when I talk about the human mind, I'm not talking about the brain. Let's assume the brain is hardware and it does the processing, and we could even forget about the brain if we like. If we just look at mind, mind is the awareness in which the experience of life arises. Now, essentially what that is saying is that the experience of life that you're having right now, where you see the table and the chairs and you can hear my voice, is arising in mind. Now, that's a bit too abstract. We've taken too big a leap to make that seem plausible. However, if we talk about a daydream that you might have, where you close your eyes and you imagine, you have a daydream about being on a beach and feeling the warm rays of sun on you, and you imagine getting quite warm, and then you decide it's time for a swim, and so you can daydream what that is like. Now, that daydream was happening in mind. It was an appearance in mind, and if we were to daydream with full intensity, it would, the appearance of the beach and the feeling of the sun rays on you and feeling and the warming up, and then the diving into the crisp, fresh water, all of those sensations could feel very real. The more intense the daydream is, the realer the experience would feel. And that daydream, that imagination, is happening inside mind, and the mind has to be aware. It is aware, and it's aware of whatever is created inside of it. So the imagination, we can say, is created by the brain, but then the brain throws the images into awareness, and awareness becomes aware of whatever images are in there. And as I said, if the daydream was a really intense daydream, then the images would be more and more refined, and the more and more refined they are, with the less and less other components in mind. So if you could hear someone talking outside, then your daydream is going to be the daydream plus maybe some input from someone talking outside. And if that gets shut out, your daydream becomes more and more refined and crisp. And so you can take that to the next level, where you have a night dream. And as many of us know, you can have night dreams that are completely convincing, because the whole experience, the whole imagination of a dream, which arises in mind, is not, doesn't have glitches in it. It doesn't have external sounds or components in it that make us know that we're just imagining within a broader context. It means the focus is completely on the dream. So hopefully that can give you an impression or give you an appreciation of how a whole manifestation, what I'm calling a manifestation, can appear out of nothing. Or really what that means is that a manifestation is not there when we're not daydreaming. And in the instant we start daydreaming, the manifestation is created. And the manifestation, in the case of this beach that you are dreaming about, is a manifestation of, you could say, thought or mind imagination. It's mind creation. Now, what if the mind was creating on a very detailed level, and it creates a whole universe? It creates a universe of time and space. And it creates a universe of time and space, and it puts in all of the universal rules and all of the universal laws. And it says, okay, this is going to be a universe with one planet in it, and that planet is going to be the only one with life on it. Now, I'm not saying that that is what this is, but let's just to give you an impression that the mind that is creating the daydream, which is not a daydream, but creating the manifestation within it, is the creator of the manifestation. And just like your dreams at night are appearances in awareness, so thought forms, so mind, essentially you could say that imagination is a form of thinking, and mind thinks. Now, let's drop the idea that thinking has to come from a brain, because we're not saying that God has a brain. We're saying God is awareness, and awareness creates. So let's say awareness can create without the causal rules that we know from within this creation. So awareness, God, source, has created all of the manifestation that we are part of as an imagination, which means a creation, in its own mind, which is what it is. So source, awareness, God, mind has manifested the world, the universe, the manifestation that we are aware of, because we are in it, as a spontaneous creation in mind. Now, when we have a daydream, it is a spontaneous creation. It wasn't there 1 minute, and then it's there. And if we look at it, if we slice it up into infinite slices, that means each slice is so small that time is not even contained within the slice. And that means that each moment, which is one of these slices, is spontaneously arising. And so that's why we're sometimes shown that life is like on and off, continuous creation and dissolution, creation, dissolution, creation, dissolution. And the thing is, we're not familiar with the dissolution. We don't experience the dissolution, because in the dissolution, we are not there, because in the dissolution, the manifestation, the dream, is dissolved. And then we must reappear fresh in the next expression of it. Now, this is essentially what is happening in a dream. We get to experience the dream as something that extends over time, whereas in fact, the dream itself is continually changing, which means a continually fresh set of images and objects, sound objects, etc., appearing one after another in mind as an ongoing imagination. So the moment that has just happened collapses and is replaced by the next moment. It collapses and is replaced by the next moment, and it collapses and replaced by the next moment. Not dissimilar to the old movie rolls that have lots of frames, and they are fed through the light, which is essentially the present moment, and it is like appearance. And as it moves out of the frame, or as the frame moves out of the light, which is essentially the present moment, it is dissolving. There is a split, we won't say second, moment of nothing, and it is replaced by the next scene. And because that happens so quick, it appears like it's a continuous movement. And it's only if it gets slowed right down that we would see frame after frame after frame after frame, much like a cartoon. And so imagination is like that. It's throwing fresh data up each moment. And the old data is replaced by the new data. And so it can be described that life or consciousness, awareness, so not really life. Life is, what we know as life is the experience arising in mind. Not our mind, but God's mind. So it is described as on and off, on and off. The on is the manifestation, and the off is the dissolution. So on is the creation, off is the dissolution of the creation. On is the creation, off is the dissolution of the creation. Now, Ramana has said as the ultimate understanding, which is relevant at a certain point of our seeking, Ramana said, there is no creation and there is no dissolution. Nothing ever happened. Now, he's saying there is no creation and there is no dissolution, nothing ever happened, as a progression, essentially, of the description I'm putting forward, which is quite clearly a radically different definition from how we all tend to experience life. And so his statement is actually, in a way, a confirmation, even though it seems like it's a denial of what I'm saying. It's actually a confirmation by the fact that it is a moving beyond even that concept, even that way of seeing life. And what it's pointing at, essentially, is the illusoriness of what we call creation. And it's really saying that if we see that the nothing, which I'm describing as God at rest, or consciousness, or mind in its non-functioning form, in its potential form, explodes into manifestation and is creation. But that creation is really at its root nothing, because mind at its root is nothing. It is pure potentiality. So source, not even aware of itself. Source in as absolute nothing, but not dead nothing, potential nothing. And creation, which seems like something. So we can look at the creation and relate to it as, oh, this is something, not nothing. This is something. And Ramana is trying to point that the fundamental nature of something is actually nothing. And so if we look at the fundamental nature of something as nothing, then what we're saying is there is nothing, and then there is nothing, and then there is nothing, and then there is nothing, and so nothing ever happened. If we start with nothing, and then let's say the nothing turns into everything, which is essentially just an imagination within nothing, and nothing is formless awareness or source. And the point of saying it's nothing is really trying to help us to get past our idea of form and how everything comes from form. So if we say that source at rest is nothing and it explodes into manifestation, and then at some point the manifestation returns to nothing, and we can look at the manifestation either as the momentary split second of creation, or we could look at it as the whole of time. And as I said, within all of time, there are all of these on and offs. But if you like, you can just condense it to the creation. So we have nothing, then we have the creation, all of time, from beginning of time to the end of time. And then at some point, the creation will return back to its unmanifest form, or source. Source, which is source in movement, will return to its unmanifest form as nothing. And so if source can start off as nothing and end as nothing, then nothing ever happened. Because nothing plus something equals something, not nothing. So it must be nothing plus nothing equals nothing. So nothing ever happened. That is a pointer that is insightful for a very narrow part of our journey. And there can be an insight to that. Or there is an insight when that is understood. But it can be called the ultimate understanding, but it's not really that ultimate. It depends which way. It's ultimate as in you can't get any less than absolute nothing. So there's nowhere to go from absolute nothing. So you could say that's the ultimate understanding. You've gone right back to source in its most basic form, where nothing exists. Time, space, the person, and not even awareness. So source not even aware of itself. That's absolute nothing. Because when source is aware in the manifestation, so if we have in a deep meditation where there is awareness of nothing, then the awareness of nothing means really nothing is a quasi-something, because there is awareness of nothing, which makes it sort of something. When the awareness of nothing falls away, then that is absolute nothing, when not even nothing is known. And so that's a very specific insight. For the purpose of happiness in daily living, and for the purpose of becoming familiar with what life is in a radically different way, we need to investigate the creation, which is where we exist now. We exist in life, in the creation, and try to get an inkling, hopefully with this framework that I'm putting forward, of how all of the things that happen are creation, is a creation, and that we are intrinsically one with, which means part of, and not separate from, the creation. So we are not creators, but we are created. The whole of time and space, all of the form in the experience of life, and the thought objects and the emotion objects and the bodies are all part of the creation of time and space. Let's call it the creation of time and space, which means the creation of this life that we're familiar with, that is a life that seems to follow very consistent laws of, for example, causality, where the creation is designed in a way that things don't just happen with no links to something else. This is a creation that includes in it apparent links of cause and effect. And it's a creation that includes in it the sense of time, the sense of linear progression within a framework of time. So it's referred to as a four-dimensional. This is a four-dimensional creation. The 4 dimensions are the 3 dimensions of space: length, width, and height, or depth, and the 4th dimension of time-space, which is all of that moving forward in time. And so that's the experience we know. This experience of life is The experience of daily life is the experience of time and space and objects within time and space. And one of the main components that helps to create the illusion or the appearance of time is memory. So memory is an object in the present moment that says, oh, I was yesterday. Now, if a daydream is a continuous movement of manifestation and collapse of manifestation, re-arising of manifestation, collapse of manifestation, which really means the thoughts, the data that when we imagine, we experience it as one imagination, but really if the sunlight comes into the imagination and the sense of the sunlight on our imagined body, when that sensation appears in the daydream, it's because of new data that's come in that wasn't there before. New information as part of the imagination, which means some of the old information must have been replaced with new information. And so we can hopefully get a picture. It's hard to imagine if our mind isn't conditioned a certain way to understand certain things. If we've been employed in a certain job that requires us to see things this way, then some of these descriptions might be really easy. It's like, of course, a film is the continual shifting of data through light. And so nothing is the same. There is the old data is continually falling away, replaced by new data. So if that's the case, then we didn't exist yesterday because we're brand new in this moment. And these words seem to be the words from a person that is consistently here, that is speaking, but maybe that's part of the illusion. Maybe this body seems to be consistently here, just like in a cartoon, that you can create yourself on the corner of a book, and you flick it in a fast enough fashion, and it will create the impression of a solid stick man dancing or walking. And it's an impression. It's an illusion. So could it be that all of time and space and form that is experienced as it feels by a person touching a book or an object that is outside of itself, and then the feeling of that is that that's very solid and real and material and form-like, could it be that that is an imagination in the mind of God? And we'd have to say, oh, well, it could be, because I have those at night when there's a dream. The dream character feels, the books and the people and the water as if it's absolutely real. And when I wake up from the night dream, I realize that none of that was really real. It was an imagination in consciousness. So who's to say that this isn't an imagination of consciousness, an imagination of awareness or God or mind, but not the God or mind that we might assume exists, because we might keep going back to, oh, I am a human being and I have a mind. But what if it's a bigger mind, what we could call universal mind? And what if universal mind doesn't need a universal body, and it doesn't need a universal brain? It just is universal mind, and the whole universe of time and space spontaneously arose and played itself out as a story of the universe. From within the story, we have the impression that it's been 13.8 billion years. Now, who knows how long that is from outside of the manifestation? The theory says it was created in an instant, because time exists only inside the creation of the universe. Anyway, that's not so important. This isn't about explaining the laws of physics. There'd be plenty of scientists who would say, oh, well, you're getting a few things mixed up. And if I was here saying, hey, I've come up with a theory about everything, scientists would rightly say, well, there's a lot of holes in your theory. The thing is, I'm not talking about a theory about everything. I'm talking about happiness for the human being in daily life. So is this helpful? And my experience is this is how we change. It's coming to see life differently. Coming to recognize primarily that we have held a version of life that we've assumed to be absolutely how it is, and unquestioning it, without question. And that's exactly what happened to humans a few hundred years ago, only a few hundred years ago, can you imagine, where the assumption was the earth is flat. And that is a belief that people had. They had no reason to believe otherwise. And then, a few cosmologists started to see some hints around the place, I think it was Copernicus, that made them question the existing belief system. And, the fact is that people don't want to hear something that challenges the belief system because it's a little bit challenging. And so these people are at risk when they put forward their new theories. And it turns out that the new theories may be more plausible or more accurate than the old beliefs. So this condition that we have as humans of believing things to be a certain way because of the way that we interpret life, which is usually a surface interpretation, is known to be an in-principle flaw that our thinking makes. So mystics, spiritual mystics, sages, have been telling us that we don't understand life as it is. And as a result of not understanding life clearly, which means not seeing life clearly, we don't understand ourselves clearly. And so what I'm suggesting is that the model that has been created by the way we develop in life is a model that essentially forces us to see life as we see it. And let's keep that in the most simple sense at first, through the senses. So how we see it, how we hear it, how we experience on a sensory level at first the world that feels like a world outside of us. And that is the model that is formed about what life is. And within that model, as it's reinforced, as it's set in place, within that comes this sense of me, which is a psychological me. And the mystics are saying that as you see life differently, that psychological me essentially gets redistributed, because the whole model of life changes, and some bits of the model in the change don't exist. They simply there isn't space for them to exist. The new model says, oh, well, this bit that was in the old model doesn't have anywhere to go because it formed because these things weren't seen. Now that these things are seen, there's no space for this bit of the old model. And what I'm talking about is the psychological me. Now, the psychological me takes life very personally. That's its design. And when it takes life personally, it feels uncomfortable. And when uncomfortableness is intense, life is unbearable. What it results in is the absence of acceptance. It is complete non-acceptance. And non-acceptance arises in the form of shame, blame, pride, worry and anxiety, expectation and attachment to outcomes. So if we go back to this model, remember, the uncomfortableness, guilt, blame, pride, worry, anxiety, attachment to outcomes and expectations are all based on the belief in personal doership. Means I see life as if it's this playground, well, not really a playground, an environment of time and space, and I move through time and space, and I make things happen. And what I do delivers results. Those results are essentially my gains or my failures in life. And so that becomes part of our sense of self. I am the one making my life look the way it looks. And you are the one that is making your life look the way it looks. And when you function a certain way and it intertwines or intersects my life, then you and your way of doing things, which is in your control, is how we see it, is affecting my life. And remember, my happiness and my life is all about having more successes than failures and more pleasurable outcomes than painful outcomes. And so we see the other and myself as the orchestrators, as the authors, the doers, the agents of life that are in control and making life happen. And so with that attitude of personal doership, we have to hate the other whenever they don't deliver what we want. We have to hate ourselves for functioning in a way that delivers outcomes that are not as we would like. We have to fear life because we never know what is going to come round the corner. We have to have expectations because we're convinced that my worth and my meaning in life, the feeling of worthiness, contentment, meaning, is going to come when I prove to myself and to the world that I am actually a worthy human being. And I'll do that by being super successful and being the best. And so that essentially is the way we see life, and that's the me that gets put in place. And it's based on this belief in personal doership and attachment to outcomes, meaning the belief that my happiness, what I am, is something that will one day be added to enough such that it feels complete, and what is going to add to it is outcomes, things out there, people being nice to me, people appreciating me gaining things that I didn't have before, material pleasures, or inventing something or creating something that everyone loves me for. And that's the modus operandi of the what I would say is we can call the false sense of who I am. And I say it's the false sense of who I am because it's a self-identity that is based on seeing life a certain way, and so it has a place. And if life is seen differently, what I would say is more accurately, then that me identity no longer has a place. It no longer, the new version of life, the old version falls away, and hopefully what is, let's say, a more accurate seeing of life means there isn't space for this idea of a me that is doing everything. Rather, it's our vision of life is, oh, I was never the doer, I was always part of what was being done by awareness or God or source. And so awareness was doing the creation. And I am part of the creation. And so my thinking, my speaking, my words, the boons and the losses that I face or that I receive and lose are all part of the unfolding of the imagination of God. Everything is happening according to God's will. Now, God's will really mean, what did we say God was? God is awareness. What's awareness's will? Awareness's will is whatever it creates. The manifestation. So if it creates rain, that's God's will. Because who created the rain? What is the rain? The rain is part of the manifestation. What is the manifestation? The manifestation is an imagination in source, in God, in awareness. And so the rain is God's will. The sun is God's will. The hunger is God's will. Whether food is delivered or not is God's will. Whether I have a thought that is a moral thought or an immoral thought is God's will. Because thoughts don't come from me. Thoughts are part of the manifestation. Thoughts are part of the imagination in God's will, the imagination in God's mind, which is not really God's mind, it's just God, which is just mind. All there is God. All there is consciousness. All there is awareness. Everything arises in awareness, is made of awareness, meaning is made of mind. It's an imagination. The dream is an imagination. It's made of mind stuff, consciousness. So everything arises in awareness, is made of awareness, and is witnessed by awareness. That's non-separation. That's oneness. So if you have 500 books on a bookshelf, it seems like 500. But it's one. It's not one book. It's one manifestation in the mind of God. And the 500 books appear as many, but they are really one. They are part of the one manifestation, which is God's will. If this is the case, then seeing my successes, which really means outcomes that happen through me that deliver positive results for myself or for society, as my doing and going, look what I did, look how good I am, that's pride, right? And it's unfounded. It was God's will. He wrote the story this way and he said, oh, I'll get something good to happen through Roger today. And then tomorrow, Roger knocks over the bottle of wine and it smashes on the floor. And someone steps on it and cuts their foot and bleeds to death. Can happen. It's God's will because it's part of the manifestation. It's what happened. And it's the attitude towards what is happening. It's either the attitude of, you did this, I hate you. I did this, I hate myself, or I did this and I love myself because I'm so good. Or it's, this is life unfolding. That it's an attitude to what is happening. One is the attitude of, I am the doer and I am responsible for everything that happens through me, and the other is the doer responsible of everything that happens through them. And the other is, ultimately, everything is part of life. And life is an arising in awareness. And awareness and what arises in it are not separate. That what arises in it may feel from within the experience like stone and wood and thought objects, but really it's all awareness, all an imagination in awareness. Now remember I said that's the Advaita, and in Christianity you have mystical Christianity and the views of the mystical Christians like Meister Eckhart and Saint Francis of Assisi and a few others, names escape me, have this very similar non-dual view. So, and then you have the mystical Islam, which is, the Hafiz and the Rumis, and they have a remarkably similar, all of them, the mystical Islam, the mystical Christianity, the mystical Judaism, which is the, I forget the name of it, maybe it's like, maybe it's the Kabbalah, I'm not sure, I can't exactly remember. And mystical Hinduism, which is the non-duality or Advaita, share this view that everything is God. And the message in all of these mystical religions or spiritual traditions is surrender to God's will, which means drop your attitude of doership. So Jesus says, I am the Son of God. God is the Father, I am the Son. So it's like saying, well, we are manifestations of Source. We're not separate from Source. So we are all the sons and daughters of God. And the mission or the underlying thing is that is about forgiveness, and then we can even go beyond forgiveness and go, well, there's nothing to forgive, because true forgiveness is recognizing that no one ever did anything of their own will. Everything was God's will, and when that's understood, there's no one to forgive. And so, in an indirect way, because that insight is very deep, but in a way, Jesus, while he was being tortured on the cross, now whether that's a true story or not, I don't know, just so people don't think that I'm saying it's all about... I value all of these traditions because I think they describe the wisdom in them in different levels for different seekers to understand. God or Father, forgive them for they do not know what they are doing. Meaning, the way I interpret is, he's not really pleading to God like, oh, please show them mercy, as if God can't show them mercy. God is the epitome of understanding. If there is a God that's going to judge us, which I don't think there is, that God would know exactly what I'm describing. He says, you did this because that was the story I created. And so Jesus is saying that essentially as a teaching or as a reminder to himself. Father, forgive them because they can't do it differently. This is the story of life unfolding. It's why he essentially didn't fight when he was being arrested, and I think St. Peter is said to have chopped off the ear or sliced off the ear of one of the guards that was trying to arrest Jesus. And Jesus got the ear. I don't really believe these stories as truth, incidentally. I think they're great metaphors. And put the ear back onto the soldier, and it healed. And so it shows he wasn't angry at the soldier. The soldier was just the mechanism by which God's will was unfolding. And Jesus, in the 40 days in the desert, had reconciled with this. Like, why is this my destiny? What purpose does it serve? And at the end, he reconciled with this. So this is the story, and there would be stories in all of the traditions, in Islam, in Hinduism, in Judaism, that have this message in there. And so there's going to be plenty of other messages for other parts of the journey, and ultimately we have to see that it's about a surrender to God's will, not seeing the other as the enemy or a competitor or a rival, which really means we understand that our happiness, our essence, our truth is what we are, and it can't be taken away by the actions of the other. So to connect with that, and then to realize that the flow of life is not where our peace and our harmony with life is going to be found. It's going to be found by dropping out of the attachment, out of the investment, and the dropping out of the attachment, out of the investment with outcomes happens when that psychological me dissolves. The psychological me is ready to judge everything in an instant. It always is judging things. It's judging political systems, it's judging health systems, it's judging prison systems, it's judging your neighbor, it's judging yourself, it's judging the environment. Right? Because that psychological me doesn't see life as inevitable. It doesn't see life as a result of all of these things before, if we look at the causal explanation, or from this more mystical point of view, it doesn't see that, well, God in this moment created government the way it is. And here we are going, oh, it shouldn't be that way. So the witnessing perspective, which means understanding it as a creation, doesn't know how to say, it shouldn't be like this. It just knows it as it is. And it's saying, oh, the absence of creation is nothing, where not even the witness exists. And then life is, or the experience of life is creation, or the manifestation, and the witness, which is essentially the witness of the mind, the awareness of mind, aware of what it has created, says, oh, this is what's created. It doesn't say this is what's created and it shouldn't be created this way. That's the role for the psychological me that is forced to feel uncomfortable with what is created. Because that's its role. So we can say that this creation is a creation of Source, where Source has identified with an object within the creation, forgotten itself, forgotten what the creation is, and is therefore forced to suffer. And at some point in the creation, the identification with object falls away, which really means the identity falls away because life is seen differently. And then there is a freedom from the suffering that is forced to happen when that psychological identity is in place. Now, as I was saying, that's the mystical perspective. And I did suggest that it might take some faith to run with that. Either faith, and I don't mean blind faith, I mean a special feeling that says, yes, this resonates. For some reason, unexplainably, this resonates. Now, I also said that faith might not be so much faith. It might just be a belief that says, "Oh, this sounds good. I like it," and we don't even know, and it feels like resonating. And so it might actually be a belief, and it doesn't really matter. It's what's helpful is if there is an ongoing movement, an interest in seeing life this way. Going, I want to know this. I want to know it where it's not just a intuition or a it sounds good. I want to know myself as Source in the manifestation, not the Source prior to the manifestation, because that's Source at rest and it doesn't even know itself. We get to know Source, let's say, be Source in the manifestation, because really all there is Source. And the Source that, the aspect of Source that we are in the manifestation is the awareness, the active awareness. So what I'm saying here is it's the body speaking. In order for us to know life in a meaningful way, as an arising in consciousness or an arising in awareness, made of awareness, witnessed by awareness, we need to find ourselves interested in knowing life differently. It means curious, it means, and not just in this moment, like, yes, I'm interested, but even after this, where the interest naturally arises while you're walking in the forest, while you're walking in the park, while you're walking in the city, while you're cooking dinner. Because all of those things, while you're sitting at your desk in front of the computer, is daily life. While you're cooking dinner, it's daily life. While you're walking in the forest, it's daily life. While you're walking in the city, it's daily life. All of which is the creation in the mind of God, witnessed by the mind itself. And what we are is that awareness. That is the silent witnessing awareness that is aware of everything that arises. And it's the components of what we can call our psyche, our intellect, that have formed based on the old way of seeing it, and they're formed in such a way that have become ingrained and habitual. And if they keep functioning, it prevents us from knowing life as a spontaneous arising in the moment. And if they stop functioning just for a bit, which requires what we might call practice, where there can be a stopping through the day, and a dropping out of certain assumptions of life, assumptions that have been put in place as part of the old way of knowing the world. One of those assumptions is that to know life as it really is, one of the things that we have to understand is that to know life as it really is, to know life from the perspective of formless awareness, thinking of all sorts needs to slow down, needs to stop. But you don't need to do the stopping as an active, so you don't have to stop the thinking as the one that stops the thinking, because that would be more thinking that says, okay, how am I going to stop the thinking? That's not what I mean by thinking needs to stop. It just slows down and fades out. Now, when that's never happened, we'll start off trying to make the thinking stop, which is more thinking, because the only way we really know how to be in life is to do through thinking, because we're not practiced at watching, at allowing life. We're not practiced at just being still and quiet and realizing life continues. So to the extent that there are trees and birds, we can just stop and be present with them and realize they exist prior to any thinking of mine. They are, and there is awareness of them. And what we might notice is that when we're aware, or when we're out where the trees and things are, we're often thinking about the past and the future. And even if we're looking at the trees, we're while simultaneously thinking about something else. And to really appreciate, or to realize that, let me be present with the trees, not as an effort of being present, but just they're there. And they're there even when I'm not thinking about them. That my thinking isn't what creates them. They are. And they're there, and there is awareness of them. So the reason this is the case is that our thinking about the world, about the past, the future, about the trees even, that says, oh, that's a nice tree, is always thinking that happens along the old view of how life is. And so, without us realizing, that thinking that seems harmless is reinforcing, is saying, hey, this is how life is. It's contained in the narrative of the thinking, and we don't even realize that thinking is reinforcing the doership, the attachment, and just the assumptions that the table and the chairs are as they appear. Whereas if we allow the tree to be there, and then even question, it might pop out in a moment that it appears as an image, as an object in awareness. And just like the dream at night, where a tree appears as an object in awareness, we might realize, I don't know that tree is made of molecules or energy. Actually, firsthand we can realize it's made of awareness, because it is being awared by the awareness in which it arises. And the bird might fly past, and we might see it. The movement of the bird might occur to us to be continually new data appearing inside mind, like one frame, another frame, another frame, another frame, that creates the impression of a bird, and then it's gone. And so if there's presence, the presence is presence with the awareness in which the changing images, including the presence of a body and words, which are no different from the bird or the tree, they're object. The presence can be presence as the awareness that is aware of everything happening. Now, another thing that is useful to remember, as well as the fact that if we're going to know ourselves as awareness, thinking needs to slow down, and that's essentially something that will happen over time as that muscle gets strengthened, and that essentially is like a sort of meditation practice. But I'm suggesting you're not trying to get anywhere or become good at it as the individual. It's the letting go of the individual and just allowing presence, which is always here, to shine through. Essentially, we're letting the character that always has been center stage, being the one aware of life, becoming just an object that is part of the arising in the moment. And so let's not hold on to the idea that it is the body that is seeing the tree. If the whole manifestation is an arising in awareness, is it not awareness itself that is aware of all of the things? And awareness itself may not be aware of things in the same way we assume awareness to be aware of things based on taking the manifestation to be absolutely real. So when we are living life as the manifestation, we assume that the eyes are what is doing the seeing and the ears are what are doing the hearing. What if, just like I suggested, awareness is all there is, and the manifestation arises in awareness and is witnessed by awareness? And what if awareness doesn't use ears or eyes, doesn't need ears or eyes or noses or tongues or nerves to sense and experience? What if all of that exists in the experience that is arising in the mind? So if you find yourself aware of the chopping of the carrots or the tree and the bird from a silent space, notice how it is awareness that is aware of all of those things. And not necessarily, essentially I'm saying, holding on to the idea that it is the eyes that are seeing keeps the perspective limited to the body-mind organism. All there is consciousness. All there is awareness. The tree is awareness, the thoughts are awareness, the body is awareness. Everything is a happening in awareness. So tomorrow, rather than doing it today, I will describe the other version of how we can see life that doesn't require the faith that everything is an arising in the mind of a universal God. We can run with the notion that there is a world of form, or let's not say of form, there is a objective, a reality. And that reality is not nothing, which is the reality essentially in the other model. The reality is whatever it is, but it's something. And in simplistic terms, let's say it is form and energy. And there are some sort of some physical living entities in that world. Probably the easiest way is to say human beings living in that world of form, much like we know ourselves. And so we're taking life more or less as it presents itself in the experience, being there, like life presents itself as a world of form. So in this model, we're saying, yes, there is an objective world. It might be much more complex than the world we know. That's why I'm calling it external reality. And external to what? External to this experience. So why is it external to the... Doesn't it seem like it is inside the experience? Or we are aware of the objective world, the tables and the chairs? So I won't spoil the punchline, but essentially I'm leading to an explanation of life more as we know it, or as is able to be supported by the observabilities of this world, and an understanding of how things work from a science-based point of view, which is basically an observation of the various physical dynamics, and then showing that the world that we have an experience of is in fact still an arising in consciousness and not some absolute truth. And from that perspective, if we come to see that essentially in the important points is not much different from the experience of life if it was an arising in God, in awareness, what we see is whichever model you choose, whichever model it is, assuming it's one or the other, both models leave us with the same appreciation of not being the doer, and therefore being able to witness whatever happens in life as an unfolding or a creation that we are in and not making happen. So on that note, we'll just take a couple of questions today, and that'll be that. Hi, Amos. Oh, just 1 second. Hi, Amos. Go ahead.
That's saying this evening. I really love the way you're combining the top down and the bottom up. It's very helpful, the way they complement each other. I have a couple of questions more relating to the bottom up framework.
Mm-hmm. I like your beard, by the way. It's different to when I saw you last. Yeah.
It's grown a little bit, yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
Thank you. So the first question, when I spoke to you before, we were talking about effortless effort, and that's kind of grown into this being drawn to just sit with the uncomfortableness inside me more and more, and feeling that kind of peak and then resolve, and noticing the framework just coming into my mind. I'm not the doer. My happiness doesn't depend on outcomes, and that seems to just resolve that. But then I can also notice another feeling coming and of wanting to repeat that and control that process. So my question is about the terminology of the working mind and the thinking mind. Mm-hmm. Does it sound like that is actually the working mind when that thought comes in, and then it feels like those two are being combined somehow, like there's two things, and slowly the thinking mind is getting less and the working mind is getting more, but they're kind of mingled. Mm-hmm. Would that be possible?
Just repeat. So just so I'm clear, you're saying that the seeing things as happening is happening, but then when it's not happening, there is a movement that wants to and tries to make it happen again, and sometimes it happens and sometimes it doesn't.
Mainly, I'm in daily life, but I'm mainly thinking of the context where I'm just sort of sitting and still, and there is this like tension, contracted energy, or it's moving, but the thoughts come in. I'm not the doer, and that just shifts. It's like that's one axis, and then my happiness doesn't depend on outcomes is another axis, and that everything just kind of becomes still and focused, and that tension unravels. But then, and that leaves a sort of spaciousness. But then over time, maybe that gets dull, or maybe the uncomfortableness comes back, and then there's a sense of, okay, let's do that again. Like, let's change the circumstances. I need to do this, and it feels like those two things are kind of mixing.
Yeah. So the thing is that when you see that cuts off the doership dynamic and the craving dynamic. So you remind yourself, I'm not the doer, life's happening, and my happiness isn't to be found in outcomes, so I don't need to be doing anything else right now, because if I felt like I had to be doing something else, or I feel guilty that I'm just sitting here, that's really because I believe that I'm missing out on my happiness by just sitting here, because I'm not going to get an outcome by just sitting here. So with that thought arising, it's just reminding you, actually, my happiness isn't in being out there. If anything, my happiness is by reminding myself that my happiness isn't to be found in outcomes, right? So that's the working mind spontaneously throwing up wisdom that cuts off suffering and brings you into presence. And you can feel the spaciousness, you can feel the peace of that, especially relative to the subtle or not so subtle doership and attachment to outcomes that might have been happening a second before. So far, so good. That's fair. And because that happens, it is demonstrating to you that there is a better way. And so that's effectively learning. That's a feedback that reinforces, yes, peace is about being, not about becoming something different. So it's reinforcing the key principles. And so when that's not there, when we go back into daily life and we see the old habit kick in, and we register, we go, oh, look, the peace isn't here, the beingness isn't here, it's taken over, then we might say, okay, so let's do what I did last time. And if it happens, if it works again, then that's great. Where it may not work is that the time before, those thoughts just arose. Like you were sitting there, and the thought, there might have been awareness of the thinking, and then the thought says, actually, your happiness isn't to be found in outcomes, and you're not the doer, which is essentially an antidote to whatever that other thinking was. And that just happened because of your genes and up-to-date conditioning, right? Having listened to the teachings, having seen how that thinking is suffering, and now started to experience the cutting off of it because the thoughts just arise. Now, if that keeps happening, that is the deepening of the peace of mind. It means there's more peace of mind happening in your month than was before. What can happen is that when there isn't peace of mind and there's suffering, the doer kicks in and says, oh, okay, let me do the reminder. And so the doer might say, I'm not the doer, and my happiness isn't to be found in outcomes. Now, if the doer has said, let me do the reminding, it's not the same as when it sort of spontaneously comes out of your system and cuts off the doer. When the doer says, let me do it, it is essentially the doer. And it doesn't have the same power. And if this is happening, you'll become aware of it. You might ask a question about it. I might give you an answer that might help you understand a nuance that you didn't understand before. You might have figured this out without me answering it, just by observing it. Frankly, I think if you can ask a question, at least it gives additional food for thought or additional pointers. So it doesn't, what I'm saying is whether you get to see this from the answer or for yourself, it doesn't really matter. And we might see, oh yes, it's the doer that says, oh, actually I'm attached to the end of suffering, and there's suffering here now, so let me do the reminding so that I get peace of mind. And I can make that happen. And so the subtle difference is where it just spontaneously comes out of your genes and up-to-date conditioning, and there is no doer, there is really the functioning of your genes and up-to-date conditioning. Or there is the doer, which is really still the functioning of your genes and up-to-date conditioning, but it is the functioning of the genes and up-to-date, because there really never is a doer, even when the doer belief is there, because even the doer belief is a result of your genes and up-to-date conditioning. However, when there is a specific type of up-to-date conditioning, which is what we're calling the belief in personal doership, when it's that part of your conditioning that kicks in, that actually is not wisdom kicking in, but doership kicking in. And so wisdom kicking in cuts off doership. Doership kicking in fails to cut off doership, and then can create more frustration, which is simply more suffering, which is because more doership has come in. And as that's seen, if that happens, then the response to that might be, the response within the system might be, let it be. Like, let the doership be, which means suffering. And if you do let the doership be, that will dissolve, so the doer won't keep trying to end the suffering. And if you let it be, it may keep trying to end the suffering, but if there's an awareness of this, it's unlikely to keep trying to end the suffering. And then you might find that the suffering that the doer was trying to cut off, which it's going to fail at, will either be destined to remain or to get cut off by the fact that you're just letting everything be. And if it is destined to remain, hopefully something in your system relates to it with the wisdom that is not the doership, that just understands life is a happening, and it's completely normal for the happening of life to include suffering for periods of time. And as my friends in India say, what to do?
Thank you. That's great. Yeah, I get a sense of just trusting the process more deeply, and that really confirmed that. Can I ask a second question?
Sure.
It's a bit more of a technical question about the way the framework talks about suffering from doership, and it talks about from self-positive actions generate pride, negative actions generate guilt, and from another, negative actions generate blame. And then there seems to be something missing in that symmetry of what is the suffering when another person does a positive action. Mm-hmm. And I had a sense of maybe jealousy is part of that, but that seems to be more about guilt and shame. But then is it possible to have suffering from praising people, from thinking, oh, they're such a great person because they did this thing, they're responsible for that and they're really great? Would you think that's a form of suffering?
I would say that the inverse of pride is a form of shame, where you're essentially looking at someone else and seeing them as superior, and by default feeling inferior. I'm not sure if... so we have hatred towards the other in blame, hatred towards ourselves in shame, both of which are because of outcomes that are negative. We have an attitude towards positive outcomes in ourselves as pride, and then an attitude towards positive outcomes of the other. I think that would have to be a problem, because it will turn into a sense of inferiority. The alternative of that is where you, I can't remember the word, but in the asana yoga practice, there is this notion where you can see the other, and often, what mostly comes up in asana yoga practice when people are in a room, there's a comparing, and often people want to compare themselves. They compare themselves with the other to try and get a sense of of how they are better in, sticking their arm in places that it doesn't normally go. Or they'll compare and see someone else doing things they can't do and feel like they're a failure. And so attitudinally, what a teacher will often encourage is, this is your own practice, and don't make it about comparing, and just keep your attention on your own movement and see everything as a happening and a movement of life and an expression of what you're capable of, that everyone has a different body. And so there is this trying to make it about what it is rather than about what it isn't or what it could be. And so there's an encouragement that if you do see someone else doing something and it's impressive, that you can look at it with appreciation, where you sort of praise the other, but not in a doership sort of way, but like in a sort of, wow, that's impressive. But without turning it into, that's impressive and I'm such a failure because I can't do it. Or that's impressive, but he's a show-off. It's just like, wow, that's impressive. Thank you, Amos. Hello, Heidi. Hello, Heidi.
Can you hear me?
Oh, yes, I can.
Yes, I can hear you now. Hello, Archie.
Hi.
Hello. Is it possible to have the video also? Do I have to start it myself?
I think so, yes, you do.
Yeah, I try. It's not possible, it seems. Okay, so I'm just... now it works. Okay, here I am. Hello, Archie. Hi.
Hi, nice to see you.
So it's the second time I'm here now?
Yes, nice, I remember.
Yeah. And my question or my thought is, when I was listening to you, it was, can it be that I started my life from the end, as I was a child? Because I had all the time the idea, I'm not interested in becoming someone or something.
Mm-hmm.
I remember when I started thinking with 13, my first thought was, oops, this could be a problem. And my starting was a near-death experience when I had 2.5 years. So I think in this time I had no thoughts. But I think it was also the beginning of the time when I came into life. But then it seems that something stopped. I can remember that time. And I have the feeling that from this time I tried to resist becoming the game like this. I'm not sure if this is a concept I made out of, really not. But if I'm listening to what you are talking about, it's so great because every thought, every word you speak is so common, is so near to me. I could talk about all these things, and most of my time I'm not. I don't have bad feelings or bad experiences like that. I'm a very happy person in all the things I did ever. But what makes me upset, is aufgeregt, is a little bit that I told it last time, I like to come in contact with people that it's possible to talk out of the talking about games like that. Can you resonate to what I'm talking about?
So you don't like, it doesn't feel comfortable talking to people that see life in a way that
practically
that isn't authentic or isn't how you are seeing. You know, if someone is caught up in small talk or stories, it's not interesting.
It depends on, no, it's not that way. Some people that has some discussions about small talks are sometimes very deeply in small talking. It's more the feeling that so many got lost in the spiral and the thinking. There are many that are inside of this spiral, but in a deepness that they don't know, maybe, but sometimes they know. It's not easy to describe what I feel or what I mean.
Yeah, well, I think it's very common to hear a description that says, you know, I can't relate to people, or I can relate to people, but if people are functioning on a certain level, it just doesn't make sense because they're not connected to something that I feel is, you know, what's important to be connected to. And so I think there's a particular time when that is especially the case, where we sort of seem to be rebelling against the old way, and usually we're changing from being like that and seeing a different way. And the rebelling, when we rebel against the other, which means it like where we just can't, that doesn't feel so good to interact that way. It's rebelling against a part of ourself that we're not really comfortable with. And that usually has to do with, you know, because we're letting go of something, and it's a process. Usually it's something that happens slowly. While we're letting go of it, we've got sort of the view of the new, and we're appreciating the new, but there's still parts of us that see life the old way. And there's this dynamic that when we really don't like something in the other, it's because it's a reflection of something we don't like in ourselves. And it could be, you know, as we're moving towards the new, there is still this part in ourself, and we can't bear to see it in the other because it reminds us of how we used to be. And I think that what happens is it becomes easier at some point to actually just have, in fact, it becomes a relief to not have to be so profound in life. And you know, we might think, oh, how can I go back to see my friends? You know, they're all talking about all this stuff that I'm not interested in. They think that this is important. And then at some point we go back and find that we can have fun there again. Something we thought would never happen. But I think it's part of our change.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. Yeah.
But it might not be that. That's just, you know, that's me trying to find out of what you said, and it's not exactly perfect with what you said, because you've indicated that this is sort of how you've been your whole life. So maybe you're not in the process of change. But when it's described by people that are realizing, oh, that's how I was living life and now I'm changing it, this is a very specific response to being in society that is living the old life, in a sense. It's like, I can't do it. There's like a
So I think it's near to what I mean. I think in my case, or in the case I'm talking from, is I'm coming back to something that I know from my childhood. It's a change in this way I'm living in now, with the people I'm living in with, and I started up being like them. But now I come back to my old form, and what I take with me is to be more entspannt, more released in this process, to come back to not to have the focus on the change, than more to realize, okay, it's changing now, so I can be released in this changing time. That's what I take with me. It's great.
No, very good.
Yeah, I stay on line. Thank you so much.
Okay, very good.
Thank you. Have a good time. Thank you.
Yes, you're welcome.
Goodbye.
Anytime. Well, actually, we'll leave it at that as the last question, because we've come to our time. So, it's tomorrow Friday? No, tomorrow's Thursday. So, yes, we'll talk about life from this other perspective, this other view that hopefully still enables us to realize, wow, we are in a creation and we are not the doers. We are part of what is arising. Peace.